In this video, we're going to talk about the differences between verbal and nonverbal communication. So in yesterday's video, we talked about verbal communication or language, and we talked about the definition of language as well as the ways in which language functions. So we're going to start out today's video by defining nonverbal communication and also having a brief discussion of the functions of nonverbal communication. Now, the definition for nonverbal communication is kind of a mouthful, but it is all the nonverbal stimuli in a communication setting that are generated by both the source and his or her use of the environment. So that reminds us that sources can utilize nonverbal communication, right? But the ways in which they interact with their environment is also nonverbal communication. So we have to pay attention to both the source and the ways that they're communicating messages without words, as well as how the environment that they choose to have that conversation in communicates information about the relationship non-verbally. The other thing we want to remember with nonverbal communication is that it has the potential to have value for both sources and receivers. So the nonverbal communication can be important for both the person sending the message and the person getting the message. So this definition, which is different from the one in your book, reminds us that nonverbal messages can either be intentional or unintentional. Right? So if you're scrunching up your face because it's really bright outside and the sun's in your eyes, you might accidentally communicate to one of your close friends that you're angry or you're upset with her because while you can't see anything because the sun's blinding you, she's walking up to you and sees you with this very sour or angry look on your face. So she might interpret that you're angry and you're upset with her when in fact you just had the sun in your eyes. We also need to remember that verbal messages also exist within a communication environment. So there's a lot of times where our verbal and our nonverbal messages are working together to accomplish a communication goal. Sometimes they're not, like in the example I just gave you, but many times we're able to appropriately align those verbal and nonverbal messages so we can achieve our goals. Now that we know what nonverbal communication is, it's also important to look at the ways that nonverbal communication functions within our interactions. First, nonverbal communication functions to allow us to express our internal states. So people make judgments about how you're doing and how you're feeling based upon the nonverbal messages that you're producing. So it's clear that the young boy in the picture is sad. His posture, his face, his eyes, they all let us know what emotion he's experiencing without him ever uttering a word to us. Because people believe that it's difficult to control our nonverbal behaviors, our nonverbal messages tend to be believed over our verbal ones. So if this young boy were to give us the contradictory message of having the face he has while he's explaining to us that he's feeling really good today, we'd likely think that he's lying to us, right? Because we'd believe those nonverbals over the verbal messages that he's giving us. We would assume that he could control his verbal message. He would know that maybe in this interaction I should just tell them I'm doing fine because that's better than lying about it. Whereas his nonverbal messages we'd assume are more difficult to control. And when you think about it, that makes sense because we have our verbal message, which is a single thing that we're communicating, right? We can control that message. But think of all the different ways we're communicating nonverbally simultaneously. So his posture is communicating something nonverbally. His eyes are, his face is, the tone of his voice when he was speaking to us would also be communicating nonverbal messages. The context around us would. So if the scoreboard says that it's the bottom of the ninth, and he's the home team and they're losing, we'd know that the game was over and he's sad because he lost, right? So there's lots of contextual clues that he can't necessarily control. And so that's why we tend to believe those nonverbal messages over the verbal ones, because we don't think people can be good at controlling all of those nonverbal channels simultaneously. Nonverbal language also functions to enable us to create an identity. So whether we're letting people know who we are by the clothes that we wear or the facial expressions that we make, we can establish distinct identities through our use of nonverbal messages. Take, for example, the people's eyebrow. So wrestling fans will likely know that the individual on the screen is WWE superstar The Rock. So people watching wrestling when The Rock was on the show would expect him to make this facial expression. And as such, this single raised eyebrow became known as the people's eyebrow. And the facial expression is really wrapped up in The Rock's character on the television show. So if another character were to make that face, we would assume that they were either trying to emulate The Rock. So if it was an up-and-coming star, maybe they were trying to be like The Rock to get The Rock's fans to come to his side, right, and want to support him as a wrestler. Or maybe we'd expect that that individual was making that face so that they, or an attempt to mock The Rock, right? So they're gonna do an impression of him so that they can mock him and make fun of him. But when they make that face, everybody knows who it is they're talking about. Because again, that facial expression or that form of nonverbal communication is tied up in the identity that The Rock created for that character. Nonverbal communication also functions to enable us to navigate our interactions. So we know what nonverbal cues we should make if we're ready to be done talking with someone. So we've met up with a friend, we're at a coffee shop, and the conversation has gone on, and we're ready for it to be over. What do? Well, we can start checking our watch, right? And so we'll consistently check our watch and let our conversational partner see us check our watch so that they know perhaps they should interject with, "Oh my goodness, do you have to be somewhere?" And so that might be one way that we can get that interaction to end if we're ready for it to be done. We might also decide to start yawning, or maybe we'll pay attention to the things in the context more than we pay attention to the person. So we'll be distracted by the conversations that other people are having, or be distracted by the other stimuli in the environment to communicate to that person, "I'm ready to be done talking with you. I can't focus on you anymore. I have to focus on all these other things because I need a break. I need to stop." Nonverbal communication also lets us repeat messages, and as such, we're able to reinforce those messages. So when I have my nephews over, there's times where they'll ask for something, and I'll just say no, and they'll keep asking me for it and keep asking me for it. And that's likely because I didn't use a lot of nonverbal behaviors behind that verbal no that convinced them that I actually meant no. So once they've been getting a little bit frustrating and they keep asking for things, perhaps I might say no, but instead of it just being no, I'll say no with my arms crossed, and it'll be a stern no, and it will be very sharp, and the tone of voice will be low. Those are all going to be nonverbal messages that are going to reinforce the fact that I really mean no, so it's not worth their time and effort to try and convince me that I should do something other than what I've already stated I won't do. So again, those nonverbals enable me to repeat and reinforce the meaning of my message in a way that enables my nephews, at least, to understand that I am not interested in negotiating on this issue again. Finally, nonverbal communication can function as a substitute for words. So we know that the guy in the picture is doing all right. We can see it through the gesture that he makes with his hands. And that's because nonverbal communication does allow us to communicate without utilizing words. So one time an individual came into the grocery store that I was working in, and he asked me for carbone. So this individual did not speak any English, and I spoke very little Spanish, and at that time I had no idea what carbone was. But I knew it sounded a lot like carbon, so I thought, okay, I'll bring him around the store to all the carbon-like products and see if any of those are what he's looking for. So I took him by like Brita water filters, right, because they have carbon in them that helps you purify the water, and that wasn't what he wanted. I took him by carbon paper, so that black paper you put between two sheets of paper so you can make a carbon copy of what you're writing, and that wasn't what he wanted. But when we walked past the baking aisle, he went and he grabbed a wire rack, and he put his hand under the wire rack and he said carbone, and then he started to pretend that he was flipping burgers on top of the wire rack. And so through this I realized that in asking for carbone, he was asking me for charcoal. Took him to where the charcoal was in the store, and he was able to buy that and go start barbecuing or making his dinner or whatever it is he needed the charcoal for. So it wasn't his words that enabled me to understand that message. It was the nonverbal communication that accompanied those words. So I didn't speak the same language. We weren't finding a way to facilitate interaction between us, but through those nonverbal gestures, I was able to understand what it was he wanted, and thus was able to help him get the product that he needed. Now that we know what nonverbal communication is and how it functions, it's also important to consider how verbal and nonverbal messages differ. One way in which verbal and nonverbal messages differ is in how we learn how to utilize them. So in school, we're taught how to properly construct sentences, right? We're taught how to properly construct messages when we take grammar and when we take phonics classes in grade school. We don't always, however, get instruction on how to properly communicate nonverbally. So our parents might tell us that we ought to sit up straight, but we don't necessarily have a class in school which is solely focused on getting us to be good nonverbal communicators. Think about what bad posture might communicate to individuals, however. So if you're on a job interview and you're sitting with your shoulders hunched the way the individual on the screen is, that might not bode really well for you in a job interview. A lot of times we're reminded that we should have good interview posture, so we need to have our shoulders back and sit up straight and communicate that we are confident in our abilities and that we would be good workers. And so having those slouched shoulders and being more hunched over communicates maybe less competence, and it communicates maybe that we're a bit disinterested or we're a bit sloppy. At least in that interview situation, that's what I would assume that not great posture would communicate. So again, we see these differences between how it is that we come to learn what is appropriate verbal and nonverbal behaviors within situations. We don't necessarily get the in-school training on nonverbal communication that we do on constructing verbal messages. One of the things that I find interesting when you think about the type of instruction we get about our message creation in schools and the fact that the U.S. tends to be a low context culture is I wonder if we were a high context culture, would we get more nonverbal instruction in our classrooms? So if our culture valued nonverbal communication more than it does, so our culture places this great value on the verbal messages, so we teach kids in school how to create those messages. But if we placed a greater value on the nonverbals than we do, would we be more likely to teach individuals in school how to create those messages? I think probably yes. And so if any of you happen to have grown up in a more low context culture and did get instruction in school or did get a lot of instruction at home in appropriate nonverbal behaviors, please feel free to share that with me, because that was one of those interesting questions that I started thinking about as I was reflecting on yesterday's material and today's. Another way that verbal and nonverbal messages differ is in how we can coordinate them. So perhaps the young boy who is looking absolutely terrified as his Final Jeopardy answer is being revealed actually has absolutely no idea whether or not his answer is right. And so the look of terror on his face is appropriate to the way he's feeling on the inside. He doesn't need to verbally state to us that he's nervous about his answer, because the look on his face communicates that to us without any words ever coming out of his mouth. We also need to recognize, however, that this kid might just be kidding. So he might know full well that the correct answer is the Emancipation Proclamation, but he wanted to fool us all, right? He wanted us and his competitors to think that maybe he didn't know what we thought he knew, and that maybe they would have a chance at winning when really they don't have a chance at winning. In the end, most of us would probably expect that this young man is actually nervous. He's not faking it. Because again, we tend to believe nonverbals operate on that subconscious level, so we think that people have less control over them. So we're going to believe those nonverbal messages when they come to us, and they contradict the verbal messages, or when they come to us without any accompanying verbal messages. Finally, nonverbal communication sends relational status and deceptive messages much more effectively than verbal messages can. So sometimes it's really difficult to sit down and have a conversation about our relationship, right? So you have a dating partner and you decide, oh, we need to talk about where our relationship is going. That conversation isn't always easy to facilitate, but a lot of times we decide we need to have that conversation because the nonverbals between us get odd. So instead of openly welcoming an embrace, we have this awkward exchange between two individuals as they attempt to facilitate an embrace within their relationship. It's very clear through these individuals' nonverbal language that they're uncomfortable with one another. Nonverbals also communicate power and status. So there are times when only people with certain statuses are allowed to utilize touch behaviors. So it's completely appropriate for the teacher to be touching the student on his shoulder, but it would be far less accepting or appropriate for the student to have his hand around the teacher's shoulder, right? So we wouldn't think that's necessarily appropriate. Finally, nonverbal behaviors also communicate deception. So there are specific nonverbal traits that people believe are associated with lying. The pictographic on the screen shows us some of those traits in an image that's there to help business people figure out whether or not clients that they're interacting with them are lying to them about their interest in doing something with the other organization. So if you look at the picture on the right, if she says it looks like a good deal, but you notice that her eyes squint and her nostrils are flaring, likely this client feels that you're taking advantage of her and you're not going to get the sale. As we wrap this video up, it's important to again remind you that most nonverbal communication is considered subconscious. So even though low context cultures don't tend to value nonverbal messages as much as verbal ones, the nonverbal messages do tell us a lot about the relationships that we have with our intercultural others. Thus, considering nonverbal behavior when you're interpreting any interaction is important, and it's something that we always need to be paying attention to.